When Clint Eastwood walked down a quiet suburban street on Valentine's Day, dressed in a worn leather jacket and dark jeans, nobody expected him to stop at a little girl's cookie stand. But when he saw 9-year-old Sophie Johnson bundled up in the cold, selling homemade cookies to pay for her chemotherapy treatments, he didn't just walk by. What happened next became a story no one would ever forget. Because in true Clint Eastwood fashion, he didn't just buy a cookie, he changed everything, and what started as a small act of kindness turned into a nationwide movement that left the world in shock. It was a sweet, comforting aroma, the scent of warm vanilla and melted chocolate filling the air, as 9-year-old Sophie Johnson stood on her tiptoes, carefully placing heart-shaped cookies onto a baking sheet. Her pink apron, 2 sizes too big, was dusted in flour, and a streak of it smudged her cheek. She didn't notice. She was too focused, her small hands steady as she arranged each cookie with care. Most kids were busy writing Valentine's Day cards or picking out candy for their classmates, but Sophie wasn't like most kids. This Valentine's Day wasn't about gifts, chocolates, or cute little love notes. It was about survival. For the past year, Sophie had been fighting Hodgkin's lymphoma. The hospital had become a second home. Chemotherapy had stolen her hair, her energy, and too many days of her childhood. But it hadn't stolen her spirit. Through it all, she stayed strong, even when she saw the worry in her parents' eyes, the way they whispered late at night when they thought she was asleep. They never talked about money in front of her, but she wasn't too young to understand. Bills kept piling up. Treatments were expensive. And no matter how many times her mom, Rebecca, reassured her that everything would be okay, Sophie knew the truth. Her parents were struggling. So instead of feeling helpless, she decided to do something about it. It had started as a simple idea. She loved baking with her mom, and Valentine's Day was all about sweets. People bought chocolates, so why not cookies? If she could sell just enough, maybe, just maybe, she could help lighten the load on her parents. She had spent all week practicing, rolling out dough, cutting perfect hearts, and decorating them with pink and red icing. Now her kitchen was filled with trays of cookies, each one made with love and hope. Outside, a light February breeze rustled the trees, but Sophie didn't feel the cold. Tomorrow, she would set up her stand. Tomorrow, she would try to make a difference. She dusted off her hands, glanced at the oven timer, and smiled. It was almost time. Rebecca Johnson stood at the kitchen counter, watching as her daughter kneaded dough with quiet determination. There was something both beautiful and heartbreaking about the scene. The way Sophie's tiny hands worked so carefully, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. For a moment, Rebecca's mind drifted back to the hospital visit just weeks before. She had been sitting with Sophie, waiting for her lab results, when she heard her husband, Daniel, on the phone in the hallway. His voice was low, strained. She didn't hear the whole conversation, but she heard enough. "We'll figure it out. We have to." She had tried to keep her face neutral when he walked back in, but Sophie had looked between them, her big brown eyes too wise for her age. She hadn't asked questions. She didn't have to. That night, as Rebecca tucked Sophie into bed, her daughter had been quiet. Usually she asked for a bedtime story or talked about her favorite baking shows. But that night, she simply whispered, "Mom, what if I helped?" Rebecca had frowned. "Helped with what, sweetheart?" Sophie had sat up, her little hands gripping the blanket. "I can sell cookies." Rebecca's heart clenched. "Oh, honey, that's sweet, but..." Sophie had cut her off with a determined shake of her head. "No, listen. People buy chocolates on Valentine's Day. Maybe they'd buy my cookies too. And if they knew it was to help with my chemo, maybe they'd buy even more." The idea was so innocent, so full of hope, that Rebecca hadn't had the heart to say no. Instead, she had kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "Okay, let's do it." And now, here they were. The kitchen was covered in flour, sugar, and hope as Sophie worked tirelessly. The counter was lined with dozens of cookies, sugar, chocolate chip, red velvet. A small stack of pink and white boxes sat nearby, ready for packaging. Rebecca handed Sophie a bright pink marker, and the little girl carefully wrote on a large piece of poster board. Her handwriting was uneven, shaky from the lingering effects of her treatments, but the words were bold and full of purpose. "Cookies for chemo, help me fight." She held it up proudly, grinning at her mom. "Think people will stop?" Rebecca swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing a smile. "I think they'd be crazy not to." Tomorrow, the world would see just how strong one little girl could be. The cold morning air nipped at Sophie Johnson's cheeks as she carefully arranged her cookies on the small folding table in front of her house. A checkered red tablecloth flapped slightly in the breeze, and her homemade sign, "Cookies for chemo, help me fight," stood proudly beside her. Bundled up in a puffy red coat, Sophie rubbed her hands together, blowing warm air into her mittens. The sky was clear, the sun barely peeking through the bare tree branches. It was Valentine's Day morning, and Sophie was ready to sell. But the street was quiet. Cars rolled past without slowing down. A jogger in a navy tracksuit trotted by, giving her a quick thumbs up before disappearing around the corner. A mail truck rumbled down the street. But the driver didn't stop. Minutes stretched into an hour, and Sophie's excitement started to fade. Her mother, Rebecca, sat on the porch watching with quiet concern. "Maybe people are still waking up," she offered. Sophie nodded, but her small fingers gripped the edge of the table a little tighter. What if no one stopped? Just as she was about to sigh, a familiar voice called out, "Well, well, what do we have here?" Sophie looked up to see Mrs. Thompson, her elderly neighbor from down the street, slowly making her way toward the table, leaning on her cane. The older woman's sharp blue eyes twinkled as she surveyed the cookies. "How much, sweetheart?" she asked. Sophie sat up a little straighter. $2 a cookie. Mrs. Thompson reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. She placed it in Sophie's small hands with a gentle squeeze. "Keep the change, darling," she said softly. "You're braver than most people I know." For a moment, Sophie couldn't speak. Then she grinned, a wide, beaming smile that lit up her face. Her hope was reignited. Mrs. Thompson's small act of kindness was only the beginning. Not long after, a group of kids from Sophie's school arrived, dragging their parents along. One of her classmates, Lucy, bounced excitedly. "Mom, this is Sophie. She's in my class and she makes the best cookies." Her mother smiled, pulling out her wallet. "Well, we can't say no to that, can we?" She bought a dozen, handing Sophie a $20 bill. Then came a local firefighter, dressed in uniform, stepping out of his bright red truck. He leaned over the table, eyeing the cookies. "I'll take 5 bags," he said, reaching for his wallet. Sophie's jaw dropped. 5? "Yup," he gave her a wink. "One for each guy at the station. And you know what? I think I'll snap a picture." He pulled out his phone, took a quick photo of Sophie's stand, and typed something before showing her. "Just posted this to our Firehouse Facebook page. Let's get you some more customers." Sophie's mom wiped at her eyes, her chest tight with emotion. People kept coming. Some stopped to buy cookies. Others just walked up, dropped a few bills into the donation jar, and offered words of encouragement. A woman in a business suit, clearly in a rush, slowed just long enough to tuck a $50 bill into the jar. A teenage boy on a skateboard grabbed a cookie, handed Sophie $10, and gave her a fist bump. A group of elderly neighbors, led by Mrs. Thompson, made sure to take pictures and tell everyone they knew. And Sophie, despite the cold, despite her exhaustion, never stopped smiling. Her hands stayed busy, handing out cookies, counting change, and thanking people with a heart so full she thought it might burst. Her mother watched from the porch, hands clasped over her mouth, as she realized something incredible. This wasn't just about selling cookies anymore. This was about people coming together, rallying around a little girl with a big dream. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden streaks across the pavement. The once lively hum of the neighborhood had quieted, the last few customers lingering, chatting, enjoying their cookies as the chilly evening air set in. Sophie stretched her arms, her body aching but her heart full. The day had been more successful than she ever imagined. The donation jar was nearly overflowing, the table that had once been piled high with cookies now nearly empty. Her mother, Rebecca, glanced at the time. "Maybe we should start packing up, sweetheart." Sophie nodded, carefully stacking the remaining cookie boxes. But as she reached for the sign, a shadow stretched across the table. A man stood a few feet away, watching quietly. He was tall, dressed in a rugged leather jacket and dark jeans. His stance was relaxed, yet purposeful, a presence that carried weight without effort. His silver hair, neatly combed back, caught the last light of day, and his unmistakable squint scanned the cookie stand with quiet curiosity. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, somewhere in the crowd, a hushed whisper. "Is that—" But before anyone could finish the thought, Sophie's cheerful voice broke through the silence. "Hi, sir. Would you like a cookie? They're for a good cause." The man looked down at her, his gaze settling on the bold pink sign that read, "Cookies for Chemo. Help me fight." A flicker of something crossed his face, something deep, something almost unreadable. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out something that made Rebecca's breath hitch. A checkbook. The air felt thick with anticipation. The remaining customers, the passers-by, even Sophie's classmates, everyone had stopped to watch. The man clicked his pen open, his hand steady as he wrote. Then, in that unmistakable, gravelly voice, he asked, "How much for all of them?" Sophie blinked, completely caught off guard. "All of them?" she echoed, looking at the small pile left. There's a lot, mister." He chuckled softly, tearing the check from his book and extending it toward Rebecca. "Should cover it," he said, his voice calm, matter-of-fact. Rebecca took the check hesitantly. She glanced at the numbers, and then her knees almost buckled. $50,000. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone audibly sucked in a breath. A murmur passed through the people gathered. "Wait a second. Is that Clint Eastwood?" Suddenly, whispers turned to realization. A few people scrambled for their phones, snapping photos, recording videos. The buzz of excitement spread like wildfire. But Sophie, completely oblivious to the growing frenzy, simply looked up at him with wide eyes. Her voice was small, full of genuine curiosity. "You must really like cookies." Clint Eastwood, Hollywood legend, director, and a man of few words, let out a deep, hearty chuckle. He knelt slightly, so he was at her level. "I just like helping good people, kid." And in that moment, it didn't matter that she didn't know who he was. Because kindness, generosity, and the power of one small act, that was something she understood. The moment Clint Eastwood handed over the check, a hush had fallen over the crowd. But the silence didn't last long. Within seconds, phones were out, cameras rolling, fingers flying across screens. The video spread like wildfire. One of Sophie's classmates' parents, a local journalist, uploaded the clip to Facebook with a caption that read, "A little girl, a dream, and an unexpected hero." Sophie Johnson was selling cookies to help with her chemo treatments today. Clint Eastwood just bought every last one, for $50,000. If this doesn't restore your faith in humanity, I don't know what will. Within minutes, the post had thousands of shares. By the time Sophie and her mom got home that evening, news outlets were already calling. The story made headlines across the country. "The sweetest act of bravery on Valentine's Day," local news. Clint Eastwood's $50,000 cookie purchase leaves a little girl speechless. National network. 9-year-old cancer fighter's bake sale sparks nationwide movement. online magazine. And it didn't stop there. Celebrities started reposting the video, adding their own messages of encouragement. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson tweeted, "Sophie Johnson, you're stronger than most grown men I know. Keep fighting, champ. Cookies on me next time. Cookies for chemo." Philanthropists and everyday people began donating to Sophie's cause. A well-known actor quietly sent a $10,000 donation, and within hours, donations surged past $100,000. That night, Sophie's mom sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, overwhelmed. But the best surprise came the next morning. A local baker showed up at their door with boxes of supplies. "If you're going to keep this going, you're going to need more flour and sugar," the baker said with a wink. Sophie grinned. She wasn't done yet. By the end of the week, Sophie's story had sparked something much bigger than anyone expected. Across the country, other kids started setting up their own cookies for chemo stands. In California, a 7-year-old girl with leukemia was inspired to sell cupcakes to help other kids at her hospital. In Texas, an entire elementary school organized a bake sale, raising $15,000 in one day. The movement grew. Parents, schools, even businesses joined in. Meanwhile, Sophie's family began receiving messages from hospitals and cancer organizations offering support. One letter, handwritten and tucked into an envelope with a small donation, stood out. "Dear Sophie, I'm 8 years old and I saw your story. My little brother has cancer and I wish I could help him like you're helping yourself. You made me believe that I can do something too. Love, Mia." Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes as she read it. Donations continued pouring in. By the end of the second week, the total had surpassed $250,000. It was enough to cover all of Sophie's medical expenses, and then some. But Sophie had an idea. "Mom," she said one evening, as they sorted through the messages, "can we help other kids too?" Rebecca blinked. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Sophie tapped the donation page on the screen. "I don't need all this money, but there are other kids like me who do." And just like that, the Cookies for Chemo Foundation was born. The next morning, a major talk show invited Sophie to come on live TV. Sitting on the stage, legs swinging, she smiled shyly as the host leaned forward. "Sophie, you've raised over $250,000, inspired kids across the country, and even caught Clint Eastwood's attention. How do you feel?" Sophie shrugged, then grinned. "Pretty good." The audience chuckled, but then the host turned serious. "Well, Sophie, we have a little surprise for you." A giant screen behind them lit up. It was Clint Eastwood. "Hey, kid," he said in his familiar gravelly voice, "I heard you're using this money to help other kids too. That's about the best thing I've ever heard." The crowd erupted in cheers. Sophie covered her mouth, eyes wide with shock, and then the host turned back to her. "We're not done yet." A producer walked on stage holding a giant check, one that read $100,000. "An anonymous donor saw what you're doing and wanted to help. Sophie, this money is for your new foundation to help as many kids as possible." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Tears filled her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just thinking about fighting for herself. She was fighting for every kid who needed hope. It had been a few weeks since Sophie's story had taken the world by storm. Her Cookies for Chemo Foundation was already helping other kids just like her, and the donations continued to roll in. But in the middle of all the excitement, Sophie remained just a 9-year-old girl who still had hospital visits, treatments, and tough days ahead. One chilly afternoon, as she sat by the living room window sketching new cookie ideas in her notebook, the doorbell rang. "Sophie, there's something for you," her mom, Rebecca, called from the front door. Sophie hopped off the couch and hurried over. Sitting on the porch was a medium-sized brown package with no return address. No fancy wrapping, no labels, just a plain box with her name written neatly across the top. She looked up at her mom, confused. "Who's it from?" Rebecca shook her head. "I don't know, sweetheart. Let's open it. Sophie pulled at the tape, her small fingers working carefully as she peeled the flaps back. Inside, nestled in soft tissue paper, was a cowboy hat. Not just any cowboy hat, a beautiful, custom-made pink one. Her mouth dropped open. It was stitched with delicate embroidery, a tiny silver star pinned to the side. She picked it up carefully, the material soft beneath her fingertips. And then she saw the note. A small, folded piece of paper rested at the bottom of the box. Sophie unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the words written in neat, strong handwriting. "Keep fighting, kid. The world needs more people like you. Clint." Her heart skipped a beat. Rebecca covered her mouth, tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh, Sophie." Sophie hugged the hat to her chest, her smile brighter than it had been in weeks. She turned to her mom, her voice full of certainty. "This is my lucky hat now." From that moment on, she wore it to every hospital visit. Whenever she felt scared or tired, she'd adjust the brim, feeling just a little braver. And every time a doctor or nurse asked about it, she'd simply smile and say, "It's from a friend who believes in me." 1 year later. The cold February air was crisp and fresh. But this time, Sophie Johnson wasn't huddled in a chair, fighting to stay warm. This time, she was stronger, healthier, and she was back where it all started. With her signature pink cowboy hat tilted slightly to the side, Sophie stood behind a brand-new cookie stand, bigger, better, and covered in decorations made by her classmates. The words, "Cookies for Chemo," were now printed on a professional banner, thanks to a local business that had donated it. But this year, she wasn't raising money for herself. "Every single dollar we make today goes to helping other kids with cancer," Sophie told a reporter, holding a microphone in front of her. "Because I know what it's like, and I don't want any kid to feel alone." The community had rallied around her again. People lined up down the street eager to buy cookies, donate, or just show support. A local news station had set up cameras, capturing the moment as cars pulled over and customers dropped bills and checks into the overflowing donation jar. Her mom stood nearby, watching her with pure pride. The same firefighter from last year, the one who had posted her photo online, arrived again with his crew, buying dozens of cookies to take back to the station. Mrs. Thompson, her elderly neighbor, arrived with her cane and a warm smile, dropping another $20 bill into the jar. And as Sophie handed a bag of cookies to a little boy in a winter coat, she saw a familiar figure standing a few feet away. A tall man in a leather jacket, hands tucked in his pockets, watching quietly. Their eyes met. Sophie grinned and tipped the brim of her pink cowboy hat in his direction. Clint Eastwood nodded once, smiling just enough for her to see. He didn't need to say a word. She understood. As the sun began to set, a woman buying cookies leaned down and asked Sophie, "So, what's Valentine's Day about to you?" Sophie thought for a moment, then handed her the bag with a big, confident smile. "Valentine's Day isn't just about love," she said. "It's about helping people, too." And with that, she turned back to her table, her pink cowboy hat glowing in the last light of the day, a symbol of courage, kindness, and the power of one small act. Her story had become a legend, and her heart, the smallest heart, had made the biggest impact of all. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even crazier.